Convincing Star Trek theory claims Lower Decks' first officer is connected to Captain Janeway's Voyager enemy Star Trek. Lower Decks features a prominent character who could have a familial tie to an underrated villain from Star Trek Voyager, and if true, the connection could completely transform how the Lower Decks figure is viewed. Across all seasons of Star Trek Voyager, the antagonist in question appeared in just one story. However, while their nefarious actions stemmed from desperation, it didn't make them any more acceptable. By contrast, Star Trek Lower Decks Season 5's cast features yet another comeback of the Starfleet officer who could be related to one of the franchise's most underrated bad guys. Jerry O'Connell's Commander Jack Ransom is the USS Cerritos' first officer in Star Trek Lower Decks. Although vain and capable of being a little insensitive at times, Ransom's personality keeps him far away from the category of franchise villains. That being said, his surname could be a big clue that points toward a potentially problematic genetic lineage and could tie him to a compelling villain from one of Star Trek Voyager's two-part episodes. John Savage played Captain Rudolph Rudy Ransom in Star Trek Voyager's Equinox two-parter, the first installment of which ended Season 5, with the conclusion serving as the Season 6 premiere. The captain of the USS Equinox harvests innocent aliens to augment his ship's speed to get his crew home faster. Although it could be a coincidence that he shares the same name as O'Connell's charismatic Star Trek Lower Decks character, a franchise like Star Trek very rarely fails to overlook even minor details such as these. What isn't clear is just how Rudy and Jack could be related. The two characters are only separated by about 20 years, which is a little bit of a middle ground when trying to delineate their positions in a potential family tree. While it's possible that Jack could be Rudy's son, there are other options, such as the characters being cousins, or Jack could be Rudy's nephew. As an outside possibility, they could even be either full or half brothers. Star Trek Lower Decks' penchant for irreverence makes it difficult to work out when the characters are acting unusually for Starfleet officers. The show is much more of a heightened and parodic, albeit canon, state of reality than other Star Trek shows, so everyone's behavior is often exaggerated, including Ransom's. Regardless, Jack's habit of taking things in his stride and approaching almost everything informally could be a way of him consciously separating himself from his infamous relative, if they are family after all. Although the story of the USS Equinox would likely have been kept between those who need to know, the events would surely have worked their way into Starfleet records. If Jack is a blood relation of Rudy's, then this could mean the commander has the right to access those files. If so, his knowledge of what happened during the Star Trek Voyager Equinox two-parter could be quietly influencing the character of Star Trek Lower Decks' first officer and making him want to make better and more noticeable decisions about what kind of man he wants to be. The Star Trek universe is vast, filled with rich lore, intricate character connections, and endless possibilities. The animated series Star Trek Lower Decks may seem like a playful take on the Trek canon, but there are compelling arguments to suggest that beneath its humor, it's deeply connected to some of the most iconic moments in the franchise. A fascinating theory is now gaining traction among fans, that Commander Jack Ransom, the charming and slightly egotistical first officer of the USS Cerritos, is connected to an enemy Captain Janeway faced during her journey on Star Trek Voyager. Specifically, this theory posits that Ransom is linked to none other than Captain Rudy Ransom, the morally ambiguous captain of the USS Equinox, who appeared in Voyager's two-part episode Equinox. At first glance, the idea of these two Ransoms being connected might seem far-fetched. After all, Lower Decks leans heavily into its comedic elements, while the story of Captain Rudy Ransom was one of Voyager's darkest arcs. However, a deeper look at both characters reveals a number of interesting parallels and clues that could suggest a hidden familial or thematic connection. Who is Captain Rudy Ransom? In Star Trek Voyager, Captain Rudy Ransom was introduced as the captain of the USS Equinox, a ship stranded in the Delta Quadrant much like Voyager. However, unlike Janeway, Ransom had resorted to desperate and morally questionable methods to survive. His crew began capturing and killing alien beings known as nucleogenic lifeforms, using their energy to fuel their ship's journey home. Ransom's pragmatic, survival-first approach stood in stark contrast to Janeway's unwavering commitment to Starfleet principles. Ransom's story arc was a cautionary tale about the dangers of abandoning one's morals in the face of extreme circumstances. Ultimately, his willingness to sacrifice others for his own benefit led to his downfall, and he perished in the events of the Equinox two-parter. While his actions were condemned by Janeway and the rest of Voyager's crew, Ransom was portrayed as a complex figure. He wasn't a typical villain, but rather a man whose ideals had been corrupted by the impossible situation he found himself in. His tragic fall served as a reminder of how thin the line between heroism and villainy can be in the world of Star Trek. Who is Commander Jack Ransom? Fast forward to Star Trek Lower Decks, and we're introduced to Commander Jack Ransom, the swaggering, overconfident first officer of the USS Cerritos. Voiced by actor Jerry O'Connell, Jack Ransom is something of a parody of the classic Star Trek hero archetype. He's physically fit, obsessed with his own image, and constantly trying to prove his worth as a first officer. While he's clearly competent, he often comes across as more interested in his appearance and bravado than in Starfleet's higher ideals. At first glance, Jack Ransom couldn't be more different from Rudy Ransom, but beneath the surface, there are a few key connections that make this theory intriguing. Both men share the same surname, of course, but more importantly, they share similar thematic arcs involving leadership, ego, and morality. The theory: family ties or thematic echoes? One of the most straightforward ways to connect these two characters is through a familial relationship. It's entirely possible that Jack Ransom could be a descendant of Rudy Ransom, perhaps his son or grandson. Given Star Trek's history of exploring family legacies and generational conflicts, think of Spock and Sarek, or Worf and his son Alexander, this wouldn't be an unprecedented narrative choice. Jack Ransom's arrogance and bravado could be a reflection of his desire to live up to or differentiate himself from his ancestors' infamous legacy. It's possible that he grew up hearing stories about Captain Rudy Ransom's disgrace, and his over-the-top heroics could be a way of compensating for the shame he feels about his family's past. In this scenario, Jack's character would take on a deeper, more complex dimension, as someone striving to prove that he's better than his predecessor while wrestling with the same temptations that led Rudy astray. Another possibility is that Jack Ransom's character arc could serve as a thematic mirror to Rudy Ransom's journey. While Lower Decks is a comedy, it often touches on serious issues within the framework of humor. Jack's obsession with his image and status could eventually lead to a storyline where he's forced to confront the darker aspects of his personality, much like Rudy did. The writers of Lower Decks could use Jack Ransom to explore how even the most seemingly heroic figures can be tempted to stray from Starfleet's principles in the face of adversity. Clues and hints in the series. There have already been a few subtle nods in Lower Decks that could support this theory. In the episode Crisis Point, for example, Jack Ransom's holodeck counterpart is portrayed as a villainous figure, hinting at the potential for darkness beneath his charming exterior. This could be foreshadowing a future storyline where Jack faces a moral dilemma that echoes Rudy Ransom's fall from grace. Additionally, Lower Decks has frequently referenced past Star Trek series and characters, often in ways that reward longtime fans with deeper knowledge of the franchise. It wouldn't be out of character for the show to subtly tie Jack Ransom to one of Voyager's most memorable adversaries.